The world of the ancient Maya was a paradox of exquisite beauty and unimaginable cruelty. Deep in the heart of the Central American jungles, beneath the unrelenting heat and the cries of tropical birds, rose stone cities that glittered with obsidian and gold. Towering pyramids cut through the canopy like blades of ambition, their steps still stained by the echoes of prayers and blood. The Maya were dreamers and mathematicians, astronomers and artists, but at the heart of their brilliance pulsed a darkness, a conviction that the universe itself was sustained only through sacrifice. Every heartbeat, every sunrise, every harvest depended on a fragile covenant between humans and gods, and blood was the sacred language that kept that covenant alive. In this world, queens were not merely royal consorts or figures of luxury. They were living symbols of creation, the physical embodiment of the earth itself, fertile, powerful, and dangerous. To rule meant to bleed, to suffer, and to give. The Mayan concept of divinity did not separate beauty from pain. Instead, it saw them as inseparable twins. Where modern eyes see torment, the Maya saw transcendence. Every drop of royal blood spilled was a gift, a key that opened the gates of the divine. Through agony came revelation, through pain came purity, and through sacrifice came cosmic balance. Imagine a twilight ceremony in a city like Yaxchilan or Tikal, where the jungle hums with unseen life. Torches flicker against limestone carvings, illuminating scenes of gods devouring stars. The air is thick with incense, copal resin, sweet and suffocating, while hundreds gather in the plaza, their faces painted with ochre and ash. At the top of the temple steps stands the queen, adorned with jade and feathers, her expression solemn, distant. She is about to perform a ritual no outsider was ever meant to witness, one that would blur the line between flesh and divinity. The crowd falls silent as she raises a stingray spine to her lips, prepared to pierce herself in the name of gods who demand both devotion and blood. This is not spectacle for pleasure or cruelty for its own sake. To the Mayans, such acts were sacred obligations, performances in the cosmic theater of life and death. The queen's pain was not her own. It belonged to her people, her city, and her gods. Each act of bleeding renewed the bond that held the universe together. Her body became an altar, her blood a bridge between the mortal and celestial worlds. She was not only queen, she was priestess, mother, and sacrifice. Yet within this devotion lies a deep psychological abyss. What did it mean to live as a divine vessel, revered yet imprisoned by ritual? What fear or faith could make a woman of power willingly offer her body to torment? To the outside world, these ceremonies appear depraved, but to those within the Mayan worldview, they were acts of supreme love, proof of humanity's debt to creation. The deeper one studies their civilization, the clearer it becomes that the Maya saw no boundary between devotion and destruction. To them, blood was the essence of life, and to spill it was to participate in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. The beauty of their civilization, the intricate hieroglyphs, the soaring temples, the meticulous calendars, was not separate from its savagery. It was born from it. The same minds that calculated the movements of Venus also designed rituals of exquisite agony. To understand the Maya, one must accept this paradox. They found divinity in suffering and grace in death. Their queens were not victims of barbarism but participants in a divine economy, where power was measured not in conquest but in the willingness to bleed for balance. As the camera lingers on the temples swallowed by vines, the narration lowers to a whisper. The jungle has reclaimed the palaces of kings and queens, but beneath the roots and stones lies a story that refuses to die. The story of the Blood Queens, women whose devotion was carved into the bones of the earth itself. Their beauty was their altar, their blood their prayer. And through the centuries, the echoes of their rituals still seem to pulse beneath the soil, as if the gods they once served are still listening. In the Mayan world, femininity was not weakness, it was creation itself. The universe, in their sacred texts, began with the breath of a goddess, the movement of her blood through the void, and the birth of all things from her sacrifice. Every queen, every noblewoman who carried royal blood, was seen as a living reflection of that first divine mother. Her body was a cosmic vessel, the womb through which the gods maintained balance between the heavens and the underworld. But this sacred role came at a terrible price. To be born royal was to inherit not privilege, but obligation. The blood queens of the Maya were chosen not merely to rule, but to bleed, to become the axis through which the cosmos itself turned. In the heart of Mayan cosmology stood the duality of life and death, embodied most perfectly by women. To give life was divine, but so too was to shed blood. The same force that nourished creation could also sustain the gods through destruction. Queens such as Lady Zok of Yaxchilan, Lady Six Sky of Naranjo, and Lady Cable Zook were revered not just for their lineage, but for their spiritual power, their ability to transform pain into prophecy. Their blood was believed to carry divine essence, a living thread connecting the mortal realm to that of ancestors and deities. When they performed rituals of bloodletting, they were not harming themselves. They were reenacting the creation of the universe, renewing the energy that kept their world alive. Ancient carvings depict these queens in elaborate headdresses adorned with jade, quetzal feathers, and serpentine motifs, symbols of fertility, power, and the cyclical nature of life. In their eyes, etched into stone with haunting precision, one can see both majesty and suffering. The Mayan world placed women at the intersection of the sacred and the terrifying. They were not simply mothers or consorts, they were conduits. Their blood opened the path to the divine, their pain unlocked visions that guided kings and priests. In a culture obsessed with cycles, of time, of seasons, of death and rebirth, the female body was seen as the perfect embodiment of the eternal rhythm. To the Mayans, the act of bloodletting was far more than a ritual, it was a cosmic performance. The queen would kneel before the altar, surrounded by burning copal incense and chanting priests. In one hand she might hold a stingray spine or obsidian blade, in the other, a strip of bark paper. With deliberate grace, she would pierce her tongue or her genitals, letting her blood fall onto the paper before burning it, sending the crimson smoke to the heavens. This was no mere show of loyalty, it was communion. The blood became the medium through which visions came, visions of ancestors, of gods, of the unseen world beyond. Through agony, the queen transcended the human realm, entering the domain of spirits who would whisper divine secrets into her soul. Lady Zok's ritual, recorded in the lintels of Yaxchilan, captures this terrifying intimacy with the divine. As her blood soaked the paper, she envisioned a great serpent emerging from the smoke, its mouth opening to reveal an ancestor bearing a spear and shield, a message of war, perhaps, or a warning from the dead. To the Mayans, such visions were truth, sacred guidance from beyond the mortal veil. Her husband, King Shield Jaguar II, watched in awe as his queen transformed into the mouthpiece of gods. Her body was the instrument, her blood the ink of prophecy. But behind this divine imagery lay the heavy psychological toll of being both adored and consumed by faith. The queen's worth was tied not to her comfort, but to her willingness to suffer. The more she bled, the more sacred she became. Every ritual reaffirmed her divine authority, and yet, with every act, she lost a piece of herself to the insatiable hunger of the gods. Her femininity was sanctified, but also weaponized. Her womb, her blood, her body, all became tools in the cosmic struggle to sustain creation. There was beauty in her devotion, but beneath that beauty lurked tragedy. Lady Six Sky's reign in Naranjo is one of the most striking examples of this divine duality. She was both warrior and mother, both queen and high priestess. Her leadership came not through conquest alone, but through ritual purity. In ceremonies, she invoked the gods by shedding her own blood, calling upon ancestral spirits to grant her power. Her rituals reinforced her right to rule and her connection to the cosmic order. She was both feared and venerated, a woman who stood between her people and the chaos of divine wrath. Yet history's silence on her inner life leaves an echoing void. Did she believe in the gods she bled for, or was she merely performing a sacred duty passed down through generations of faith and fear? In the eyes of her subjects, the queen was not mortal. She was living myth. The sight of her blood flowing was proof that the gods still listened, that the covenant between heaven and earth had not been broken. Each ritual renewed faith, but also deepened the illusion that power was inseparable from suffering. In the Mayan cosmos, to be divine was to endure pain, and no one bore that burden more intimately than the Blood Queens. Their bodies became the stage upon which cosmic drama unfolded, their sacrifices the heartbeat of an empire obsessed with balance. To the modern mind, it is easy to see these acts as barbaric, yet to the Maya, they represented the highest form of devotion. A queen's blood was not a symbol of weakness, but of power, the very essence of creation flowing from her veins. Her role was both sacred and suffocating, adored as goddess, bound as servant. In the flicker of the torchlight and the sound of her blood falling upon stone, the people saw eternity reflected. And as the smoke rose into the night sky, they believed, for one fragile moment, that the universe itself had been made whole again. Blood was the breath of the gods. In the Mayan world, it was not merely a symbol of life, it was life itself, the raw essence that connected all living beings to the divine machinery of the cosmos. To shed blood was to speak to the gods in their own language, a language written in pain and devotion. The rituals that brought this sacred communion to life were not performed in shadows but in the open air, before the eyes of the people, where devotion could be witnessed, recorded, and remembered. And at the center of these ceremonies stood the Blood Queens, women of exquisite power and terrible faith, whose elegance masked the agony required to maintain the balance of heaven and earth. A typical ritual began at dusk. The sun, sinking behind the stone pyramids, bathed the temples in a golden light that turned red as it faded. The crowd gathered in tense silence. Musicians played slow, rhythmic beats on turtle-shell drums. Incense rose from clay burners, curling like serpents into the humid night air. At the heart of the temple stood the queen, her skin painted with cinnabar, her garments shimmering with jade beads and feathers of the sacred Quetzal bird. Every motion she made was deliberate, rehearsed, and divine. Around her, priests chanted ancient verses that traced back to the dawn of the world, summoning the gods to witness the sacred act about to unfold. The queen held in her hands the instruments of communion, an obsidian blade sharp enough to cut a thought, and a thin cord of woven bark. These objects were not weapons, they were keys. As the drums slowed, she pressed the blade against her tongue. The crowd held its breath. A single movement, deliberate and graceful, tore open a passage between flesh and spirit. Her blood began to flow. It was caught on the bark paper, soaked through until the fibers glowed dark crimson. The paper was then burned, and as the smoke rose into the night, the gods were believed to inhale the offering, their hunger momentarily sated. Pain was the bridge to revelation. For the Mayans, it was not a punishment but a form of awakening. As the queen bled, her mind would drift between consciousness and trance. The combination of pain, rhythmic music, and blood loss created a state that the Maya called the path of vision, a doorway into the spirit realm. Through this state, the queen could see beyond the physical world, into the domain of gods and ancestors. These visions were not hallucinations to her people, they were divine communication. What she saw, what she heard, could determine the fate of kingdoms. A single ritual could bring rain, victory in war, or peace between rival cities. Her agony was not wasted, it was the lifeblood of empire. The methods of bloodletting varied. Some rituals required the piercing of the ears or the cheeks, others demanded deeper sacrifice. The most sacred ceremonies called for the laceration of the tongue, the navel, or the genitals, areas believed to hold the greatest concentration of spiritual power. The queen would thread a cord through the wound, pulling it slowly to release more blood, each drop a word in her silent prayer. Every movement was an act of devotion and theater. The people below the temple steps watched in reverent awe, their faces lit by firelight, believing that through their queen's suffering, the gods themselves were watching back. The ritual did not end with blood. It continued into the realm of visions. As the queen swayed from blood loss, the world around her began to dissolve. The smoke thickened, and the air seemed to vibrate. Witnesses described her eyes rolling back, her lips whispering in forgotten tongues. In this state, she would see the forms of gods emerging from the smoke, jaguar-headed spirits, serpents crowned with flames, and ancestors clothed in bone and starlight. These beings would speak to her, offering commands, prophecies, or warnings. What she saw in those moments shaped the destiny of her people. Her visions were recorded in hieroglyphs, carved into stone lintels and painted on the walls of temples. To this day, they remain among the most haunting artifacts of human spirituality, images of queens in trance, their blood flowing like rivers, their faces serene with divine purpose. But the true horror and beauty of these rituals lies in how deeply they blurred the boundary between ecstasy and torment. To the Mayans, the act of bleeding was not an end in itself. It was a transformation. Through pain, the queen became divine. Her suffering was eroticized, sanctified, and eternalized in art. The same society that built observatories and developed advanced mathematics also built altars where women sliced open their flesh to feed invisible gods. Their devotion was not metaphorical, it was carved into their bodies. Each ritual reaffirmed the cosmic order, reminding the people that their world thrived only through sacrifice. From a modern perspective, these rituals are almost unbearable to imagine. The sting of obsidian on skin, the taste of iron on the tongue, the heat of torches pressing against the night, all performed under the unblinking gaze of an expectant crowd. Yet in the Mayan worldview, such acts were not perverse. They were holy. The bloodletting ceremony was a microcosm of the universe's own cycle: creation, destruction, and renewal. Just as the gods once tore themselves apart to form the world, the queen tore her flesh to maintain it. Her blood was the same blood that flowed in the veins of the gods. Through her sacrifice, the cosmos continued to turn. There was a strange kind of empowerment in this submission. The queens were not victims but participants in a sacred covenant that transcended mortal comprehension. Their pain was not imposed, it was chosen. To suffer for the gods was to wield a power greater than any army or throne. The Blood Queens became living portals between the mortal and the divine, and their bodies were the instruments through which creation was renewed. As the ritual ended, the queen would be carried away, pale and trembling, her blood soaked into the earth. The drums would slow to silence. The priests would declare the gods appeased, and the people would erupt in chants of praise. The torches burned low, casting long shadows across the temple walls. In that moment, the queen had ceased to be human. She had become something else, a being both feared and adored, a woman whose body bore the weight of the universe. And as the final embers of incense faded into the night, her sacrifice lingered in the air like a whispered prayer, reminding all who witnessed it that beauty and horror, life and death, were forever entwined in the sacred rhythm of Mayan belief. The night of the serpent was unlike any other. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, thick with the scent of burning copal and the low hum of drums that echoed like distant thunder through the limestone plazas of Yaxchilan. At the heart of the temple complex, beneath carvings of gods with jaguar faces and serpents coiled in eternal motion, Lady Zoc prepared for her most sacred and most terrifying ritual. She was the queen, consort to Shield Jaguar II, but in this moment she was more than a ruler. She was a living bridge between worlds, about to summon the gods themselves through the wound of her own flesh. What would follow that night would become one of the most haunting scenes ever recorded in Mayan art, the vision serpent rising from the smoke of her sacrifice, carrying spirits that blurred the boundary between life and death. Lady Zoc's preparation began hours before the ceremony. Servants bathed her in sacred water scented with crushed herbs and flowers, cleansing her of mortal impurity. Her skin was painted with cinnabar, a symbol of life and blood, while her face was adorned with streaks of blue to invoke the power of the underworld gods. Around her waist hung jade ornaments that clinked softly as she moved, each stone carved with prayers to the ancestors. The queen's calm was not serenity, it was the iron control of a woman raised to believe her pain had purpose. She was to perform the serpent conjuring, a blood ritual so sacred that only royal women of divine lineage were permitted to attempt it. As the night deepened, the temple plaza filled with nobles and priests. Torches flickered in the humid air, casting serpentine shadows along the walls. The drums slowed to a heartbeat rhythm, steady and suffocating. Lady Zoc ascended the temple steps with deliberate grace, her bare feet silent against the stone. In her hands she carried the tools of her ritual, a woven cord of bark and an obsidian blade polished to a mirror sheen. She knelt before an altar carved with scenes of creation, gods cutting open their own bodies to birth the world. For the Maya, creation was inseparable from sacrifice, and blood was the medium through which reality itself was renewed. The queen pressed the blade to her tongue. The obsidian cut clean and deep, slicing through the flesh with practiced precision. Her blood began to flow, thick and dark against her painted skin. She took the cord and threaded it through the wound, pulling it slowly, deliberately, each tug sending a ripple of agony through her body. The crowd watched in reverent silence. Every movement was sacred choreography, every drop of blood carried a prayer. She bled until the bark beneath her was soaked crimson, then offered it to the priests, who fed it into the fire. The smoke began to change. It thickened, twisting into strange shapes that seemed to move with purpose. Lady Zock's body swayed, her vision blurring from the loss of blood. The drums continued, their rhythm becoming faster, more chaotic, as if mirroring the beat of her failing heart. She entered the state of trance, the sacred in-between where flesh and spirit dissolved into one. Those who stood near her later claimed the air around her shimmered like heat rising from stone. Then, from the swirling smoke above the altar, something began to emerge. The vision serpent. Its form was vast, coiling, and alive with flickering light. It rose from the offering fire, scales rippling with the colors of blood and emerald flame. Its mouth opened wide, and from within its jaws stepped a warrior spirit, clad in the ornaments of the dead. The crowd gasped but did not move. They believed this was no illusion, it was revelation. The serpent was the umbilical cord of creation, the link between gods and mortals, heaven and the underworld. Through her blood, Lady Zock had birthed the divine into the world once more. To the modern mind, it is tempting to call it hallucination, a vision shaped by pain, blood loss, and smoke. But to the Maya, there was no distinction between vision and reality. The serpent was as real as the temple stones, its message as binding as royal decree. The warrior spirit that appeared in its jaws was said to be an ancestral god, perhaps Shield Jaguar's divine forebear, come to bless or warn the royal family. In this moment, Lady Zock was both priestess and medium, her body a vessel through which the unseen spoke. Archaeologists have preserved this moment in exquisite detail, carved into lintel 25 of Yaxchilan, a stone relief that captures the precise instant of revelation. Lady Zock kneels before the serpent, her face serene despite the agony she must have felt. The creature towers over her, its fanged mouth wide, its body alive with curling smoke. To anyone who gazes upon the carving today, it is more than art, it is a frozen memory of faith, a record of humanity's oldest impulse, to reach beyond the mortal boundary and touch the infinite, no matter the cost. The symbolism of the serpent ran deep in Mayan belief. It represented the cyclical nature of life and death, the bridge between the worlds of men, gods, and ancestors. It was both creator and destroyer, its coils shaping the universe itself. When Lady Zock summoned it, she was not merely calling on a god, she was invoking the structure of existence, demanding that the cosmos recognize her blood as its lifeblood. Through her pain, she became creation itself, her body mirroring the cosmic wound through which all things were born. But beneath the glory and mysticism lies an unbearable humanity. One cannot ignore the trembling of her hands, the exhaustion in her gaze, the fragility of her body under the weight of expectation. In the carved stone, her devotion looks eternal, but in reality, it was flesh and breath and fear. How much blood did she lose that night? How close did she come to death? These are questions history cannot answer. Yet they remind us that every act of divine communication was rooted in mortal vulnerability. The gods demanded perfection, and perfection required pain. When the smoke cleared and the serpent faded back into the darkness, Lady Zock collapsed. Priests rushed to her side, pressing cloth to her wounds, whispering prayers of thanks. The ritual was complete. The gods had spoken. The people of Yaxchilan would remember this night not as one of horror but of triumph, a queen's devotion powerful enough to pierce the veil of worlds. Yet in that triumph lingered tragedy. Lady Zock had glimpsed eternity, but at the cost of her own blood and sanity. For the rest of her days, she would carry the scars of her vision, a reminder that enlightenment and agony are often one and the same. In the stillness after the ritual, as the crowd dispersed and the jungle reclaimed its silence, the scent of burnt blood hung in the air. The stars above glowed faintly through the haze, as if watching. Somewhere in the distance, a jaguar roared, a sound the Maya believed was the gods echoing their approval. Lady Zok had given the heavens what they demanded, proof that the blood of queens still bound the world together. And though centuries have passed, her serpent still rises from the smoke of history, a haunting image of faith so absolute it devoured itself. In the world of the ancient Maya, the act of sacrifice was never random cruelty, it was cosmic necessity. The gods were not immortal beings of endless generosity, they were entities that hungered, entities that demanded nourishment to sustain the fragile balance of existence. The universe, as the Maya believed, was born from sacrifice. The gods themselves had torn open their own bodies to give life to creation, and in return, humanity was bound to repay that debt in blood. For the kings, it meant leading wars and capturing prisoners for ritual death. But for the queens, those divine vessels of fertility and life, it meant something more intimate, more terrible. Their blood and womb were the living altars of the cosmos. They were the wombs of sacrifice, the mothers of both creation and destruction. The role of the Mayan queen was a paradox wrapped in divinity. She was the symbol of beauty, fertility, and abundance, yet she also carried the weight of death within her. Her power was sacred, but it was not her own. It belonged to the gods she served. When drought struck, when crops failed, when the sky withheld its rain, it was often the queen who was called to restore balance. She did so not through decree or conquest, but through her own suffering. By offering her blood, she reenacted the original sacrifice that birthed the world. Her pain became the ritual language of salvation. Rituals of fertility were among the most sacred duties of royal women. On certain holy days aligned with celestial events, eclipses, solstices, or the zenith passage of the sun, the queen would ascend the temple steps to perform the ceremony that ensured the renewal of life. These were not spectacles of death but of divine intimacy, rituals that bound the rhythms of the human body to those of the cosmos. In the dim light of torches, before the gathered people, she would draw blood from her womb or navel, the places where life began. The priests would collect it on bark paper, mix it with resin, and burn it so the smoke might rise to the heavens. That smoke, they believed, carried her essence to the gods of fertility, who would bless the earth with rain and grain in return. Yet not all rituals were symbolic. Some demanded more than the queen's blood, they required life itself. There are inscriptions and murals that suggest noble women oversaw or participated in the sacrifice of captives, sometimes even of their own kin. These acts were not seen as barbaric but as reenactments of divine myth. In one such story, the goddess Ixchel, the lunar mother, sacrificed her own creation to give birth to the next age. To imitate her was not sin, it was duty. Some queens even offered their children to the gods, believing that through death they would ascend as divine intermediaries. The mother's tears, shed upon the altar, were believed to fall as rain upon the earth, fertilizing it with both sorrow and faith. In the city of Naranjo, Lady Six Sky performed such rites with an iron grace that terrified her enemies and mesmerized her followers. Historical records depict her standing above rows of bound captives, their faces painted with the blue of sacrifice. She would not wield the blade herself, that was the role of priests. Yet her presence sanctified the act. Her voice would rise in chant, invoking the gods of maize and storm, her body swaying with the rhythm of drums. Each drop of blood spilled before her was believed to renew the covenant between heaven and earth. Her hands might never have touched the obsidian blade, but the power of her gaze made her complicit in every death. The people believed she carried within her the dual spirit of life and destruction, the essence of the divine feminine that the gods themselves both feared and adored. The act of giving blood from the womb carried deeper symbolic meaning than any other ritual. It represented the cycle of fertility, decay, and rebirth, the eternal return of creation. The queen's body mirrored the earth itself, fertile, bleeding, regenerating. Her menstrual blood was sacred, believed to contain the same essence that nourished crops and birthed the cosmos. In secret chambers, away from the eyes of the masses, royal women performed smaller rites where they offered this blood to the idols of fertility gods, whispering prayers for their city's abundance. What modern eyes might see as horror, they saw as harmony. There was no shame in blood. It was the substance of divinity itself. There are stories, whispered through time, of queens who took the rituals further than faith required, women so consumed by devotion that they blurred the line between sacrifice and self-destruction. One tale speaks of a nameless queen whose kingdom suffered years of drought. In desperation, she offered her own life, entering the sacred cenote, a natural well that served as the mouth of the underworld. Draped in white cloth and jewels, she descended into the waters while her priests sang hymns to Chak, the rain god. Her body was never recovered, but the rains came soon after. To her people, she became a goddess, the queen who drowned herself to awaken the sky. What made these rituals so haunting was their logic. To the Maya, blood was not horror, it was hope. The spilling of blood was a dialogue, a negotiation with unseen powers. When a queen bled, she was not losing vitality, she was offering it to maintain the world's fragile equilibrium. Each ritual carried a moral gravity. If she failed, her people might starve. The burden of belief pressed upon her shoulders heavier than any crown. Her beauty, her fertility, her divine status, all were shackles of expectation. The gods had chosen her to bleed for creation, and to deny that duty would be to defy the cosmos itself. Archaeological evidence supports the depth of this conviction. In temple murals and reliefs, the queen's image is often paired with symbols of both birth and death. Serpents coiled around skulls, flowers blooming from bones, the rising sun reflected in pools of blood. These were not contradictions, they were truths of the Mayan worldview. Life demanded death, and death nourished life. The queen stood at that threshold, forever balancing creation on the edge of a blade. As the final embers of the ritual fires died, and the people dispersed into the darkness of the jungle night, the queen would remain on the temple steps, her body weakened, her skin pale from loss. Yet her eyes would shine with something unearthly, a quiet knowing that she had momentarily held the fate of her world in her own veins. Her blood had become the lifeblood of creation. Her pain was the promise that tomorrow's sun would rise. The modern world can only look upon these acts with disbelief, seeing cruelty where the Maya saw devotion. But beneath the veil of brutality lies a profound, almost poetic truth about human nature, the desire to give meaning to suffering, to believe that pain can preserve life, that death can birth renewal. The Blood Queens were both victims and visionaries, women who bore the weight of the universe in their bodies and believed that through agony, they could touch eternity. The Mayan world was a civilization of spectacle, a people who turned suffering into ceremony, faith into theater, and pain into performance. To witness a royal ritual was to witness the merging of art, religion, and death into something transcendent and terrible. It was not chaos, but choreography. Every movement, every drop of blood, every cry and drumbeat carried meaning. The plazas of great cities like Tikal, Copan, and Palenque became sacred stages where the divine and the mortal played out the oldest story known to humankind, the story of sacrifice. And at the heart of this theater stood the Blood Queens, radiant and dreadful, their beauty illuminated by the flicker of torches as they gave themselves to the gods before the eyes of thousands. The ceremonies began long before the first drop of blood was shed. The preparations were themselves acts of devotion. The priests painted their bodies with blue and black, the colors of death and rebirth, while the air filled with the scent of copal, the sacred resin burned to carry prayers skyward. The queen, the living embodiment of the divine feminine, was adorned in garments of jade and feathers, her face veiled with a net of shells that clicked softly as she moved. To the Mayans, sound was not ornamentation, it was invocation. Every note of a flute, every rattle of bone, every murmur of chant was a bridge between the human and the cosmic. When the procession began, the city would fall into reverent silence. Drums beat like thunder rolling over the jungle, slow and deliberate, mimicking the pulse of the earth. The queen walked at the center of a retinue of dancers and acolytes, their bodies swaying in unison, faces painted as gods, ancestors, and beasts. Behind them followed the captives, men and women from conquered cities, their fates already sealed. They were not seen as victims but as vessels of divine will, chosen to feed the insatiable hunger of the heavens. In the Mayan world, death was not the end, it was the turning of a wheel, a necessary act to keep the cosmos alive. As the queen reached the temple steps, the crowd erupted in a chant that grew louder with every heartbeat. The sound was overwhelming, drums, flutes, human voices rising into a single trembling note that seemed to shake the very stones. The priests would spread the bark paper offerings, already soaked with the queen's earlier bloodletting, across the altar. Then came the climax, the sacrifice. The captives were laid upon stone slabs, their chests painted with the red spiral of the sun. The high priest, using a blade of obsidian, would pierce the flesh with swift precision, tearing through muscle to reach the heart. He would raise the still-beating organ toward the heavens, offering its warmth to the gods before placing it upon the fire. Smoke, blood, and ash became one, the material and spiritual fusing in a single gesture of devotion. The queen stood above it all, her face unmoving, her body trembling beneath the weight of ritual. She was not spectator, nor executioner, but mediator. It was her divine right, and her curse, to sanctify what occurred. She had already given her own blood, proving her purity before the gods. Now, through her presence, she legitimized the taking of others' blood. Her eyes, lined with black pigment, watched the flames rise as the priests threw maize, jade dust, and hearts into the fire. Each offering symbolized a different realm, earth, sky, and underworld. The people below wept and cheered, believing that through this act, their city would flourish, their crops would grow, and their dead would find peace in the afterlife. There were other rituals, darker still, hidden from public sight. Accounts and carvings suggest ceremonies where blood and sexuality intertwined, acts of symbolic union between queens and gods of fertility, performed not for pleasure but for cosmic renewal. In torchlight and incense haze, the boundaries between body and divinity dissolved. Menstrual blood, semen, and sacrificial essence mingled as offerings to the gods who ruled both birth and decay. To the modern eye, these acts seem obscene, yet in the Mayan mind, they were sacred, the reenactment of creation itself. The gods had created the world through blood and desire, and so humanity renewed the covenant through the same primal forces. The theater of pain was not only an act of faith but also a demonstration of power. To the people, the spectacle affirmed their queen's divine right to rule. Her endurance in ritual proved her closeness to the gods. Her composure as hearts burned upon the altar was a sign of strength, her serenity a reflection of divine favor. The more elaborate the ceremony, the greater the awe, the deeper the loyalty of her subjects. Through ritual, the Mayan elite controlled not just the faith of the people but their very understanding of existence. Pain became politics, suffering became statecraft. At night, when the fires burned low and the chants dissolved into the hum of the jungle, the remnants of the ritual lingered in the air. The temples glowed with the last embers of sacred fire, their walls still wet with blood. The queen would retreat to the inner sanctum, where only priests and attendants could follow. There, her wounds would be treated with crushed herbs and obsidian ash, her skin trembling under the sting. She would not cry out. To show pain was to betray weakness. Her silence was her final offering, an unspoken testament to her endurance. The gods demanded that their queens be both mortal and immortal, both mother and martyr. In the days that followed, the people would tell stories of what they had seen, how the gods had accepted the offering, how the smoke had twisted into the shape of a serpent, or how the rain had fallen the next morning. The ritual's success was measured not in survival but in signs: a rainbow, a crop's growth, a dream. Faith was self-fulfilling because it had to be. The theater of pain was not only performance, it was persuasion, the collective illusion that suffering could keep the stars from falling. But beneath the grandeur and devotion lay an unspeakable truth: the rituals were escalating. As the centuries passed and the empire faced drought, famine, and internal decay, the ceremonies became more desperate, more violent. The gods were silent, and so the people screamed louder, bled deeper. The theater of pain, once a controlled ritual, became a frenzy of fear. The queens, still bound by duty, continued their offerings, believing that only their agony could hold back the end. The line between faith and madness blurred, until the rituals that once sustained life became instruments of ruin. Still, there was beauty even in the horror. The architecture, the music, the carved depictions of flame and feather, all spoke of a civilization that believed deeply in the sanctity of sacrifice. Their ceremonies were not acts of savagery but of longing, a desperate human attempt to touch eternity, to be remembered by gods who may never have existed. The theater of pain was the heartbeat of a dying empire, a civilization performing its own requiem beneath the indifferent stars. And when the fires finally went out, when the temples crumbled and the jungle reclaimed the plazas, the echoes of those ceremonies remained. The wind through the trees still carries the rhythm of drums. The stones, etched with serpents and queens, still bear silent witness to the nights when humanity believed that through suffering, it could command the cosmos. The theater is gone, but its story endures, a testament to how far devotion can lead us and how easily beauty can turn into blood. The gods of the Maya were not beings of mercy. They were powerful, unpredictable, and ravenous, a pantheon that demanded constant attention, endless offerings, and above all, the steady pulse of blood. To the Maya, the divine world mirrored the human one, filled with desire, jealousy, love, and cruelty. The gods created life, but they could also destroy it without warning. And it was the duty of queens, kings, and priests to keep them appeased, to remind them that humanity still remembered the original pact, life in exchange for pain. Yet among these gods, some stood apart, deities of suffering and rebirth whose own myths reflected the dark rituals humans performed in their honor. These were the gods of pain, and through them, the Mayan Blood Queens found both their inspiration and their torment. At the heart of Mayan mythology stood Ixchel, the moon goddess, a figure both nurturing and terrifying. She was the goddess of fertility, childbirth, and weaving, but also of storms, floods, and death. Her duality mirrored that of the queens who bled for her, givers of life and harbingers of death. In ancient murals, Ixchel is often depicted holding a jar of serpents, pouring their venom over the earth, a metaphor for both the cleansing rain and the destruction it brings. To please her, queens offered their blood from the womb, the very source of life, believing that their pain mirrored hers. In their suffering, they reenacted the goddess's own self-sacrifice, the mythic act that birthed the moon and renewed the world. The priests would speak of Ixchel's descent into the underworld, how she tore herself open to release the rivers that sustain creation. The queens, too, followed this path, offering their bodies as the living expression of divine agony. They were told that only by understanding pain could they access true power, for pain was the language of the gods. In one sacred hymn preserved in hieroglyphs, the suffering of the goddess is described as the thread that binds the sky to the earth. When the queens bled, they believed they were continuing that cosmic weaving, their veins the loom upon which reality was kept intact. But Ixchel was not alone in her cruelty. Another god, Kawil, the serpent of fire and lightning, demanded offerings of royal blood. He was the symbol of royal lineage and divine right, his image carved into the foreheads of kings and queens alike. Legends say he was born from a wound, lightning splitting the head of the creator god to release him into the world. Thus, pain was his origin, suffering his essence. Queens often invoked Kawil before performing bloodletting rites, drawing from their tongues or genitals to awaken his fiery spirit within them. As the first drops fell to the ground, the priests whispered that the god himself was feeding through them, that his lightning burned in their veins. The connection between the divine and the human was never metaphorical in the Mayan world. It was physical. The gods were not distant abstractions. They were tangible presences that moved through blood and breath. The rituals of pain were designed not to symbolize devotion but to incarnate it. When a queen offered her blood to Ixchel or Kawil, she became them. The boundaries between mortal and divine dissolved in the act of sacrifice. It was not worship, it was transformation. Through agony, the queen transcended her humanity. Through blood, she became eternal. Another terrifying deity was Apuk, the skeletal god of death and decay, the ruler of the underworld, Xibalba. He was the god who laughed in the face of suffering, the devourer of souls, the silent witness to every ritual of blood. The Maya did not fear Apuk as an enemy but revered him as a necessary force, for death was the foundation upon which life was built. Some ceremonies required the presence of his image, skulls carved in jade, painted black with soot and cinnabar, to remind those who offered blood that death was not punishment, but passage. The queens prayed to Apuk not for mercy but for balance, asking that he guide the souls of the sacrificed safely into the next world. To the Mayan mind, pain was the bridge between these realms. It was through suffering that the human body could open the veil to the gods. When the queen drew the obsidian blade across her skin, she did not merely bleed, she released a part of her soul into the cosmic order. Her agony was not private, it was performative, a sacred offering that ensured the world would not collapse. Every scream, every shiver of her body, was a form of divine communication. The gods were not moved by words, only by the pulse of pain, the heat of sacrifice, the raw essence of life. In the temples, rituals were often accompanied by reenactments of divine myths. The priests recited the stories of gods who had suffered to create humanity, their voices echoing through chambers lined with skulls and flickering torches. The queens stood at the center of these rituals as living embodiments of those myths. When she bled, the queen became Nine-Shell in her agony. When lightning flashed, she became Kawil incarnate. The people below watched in awe, believing they were witnessing not their queen's pain but the gods themselves reborn in human flesh. The ceremony was not a memory, it was a resurrection. But behind the ritual glory lay a deeper psychological truth, one that modern minds struggle to comprehend. The Blood Queens lived in a world where divinity demanded intimacy with pain. To them, suffering was not punishment but privilege. To bleed was to be chosen. The gods loved those who could endure their cruelty, for endurance proved faith. It was believed that only those who could mirror the gods' own agony were worthy of their favor. In this brutal theology, the line between holiness and torment vanished. The queen's agony was the ultimate prayer, and her silence, the purest hymn. The rituals often left scars that became symbols of devotion. The queens would wear their wounds like jewelry, each mark a testament to the gods they had pleased. In later years, as they aged and their beauty faded, these scars became their crowns, proof that they had suffered for the survival of their people. To touch the body of a queen was to touch the history of divine pain. Her skin was scripture, her veins sacred text. And yet, even within this culture of agony, there were whispers of doubt, faint echoes that haunted the priests and the queens alike. What if the gods did not hear? What if all the pain, all the blood, was for nothing? In the final centuries of the Mayan civilization, when droughts worsened and cities fell into ruin, those doubts grew louder. The gods of pain, once believed to sustain the world, seemed to abandon it. The rituals became more frantic, the sacrifices more desperate. The queens continued to bleed, but the rain no longer came. The fire of Kawil flickered out, and Nine-Shell's moon wept unseen behind clouds. In that silence, perhaps the Blood Queens realized the final, devastating truth. The gods they had served so faithfully were reflections, not of heaven, but of themselves. Their rituals, their pain, their devotion were human attempts to make sense of a cruel and beautiful universe. The gods of pain lived not in the sky but in the human heart, where faith and fear intertwine. And even as the temples crumbled and the jungle swallowed their cities, the legacy of their suffering endured, a reminder that humanity will always seek meaning in its agony and divinity in its wounds. The line between devotion and cruelty in the Mayan world was thin, often impossible to distinguish. For the Blood Queens, pain was not merely a tool of religious observance, it was the currency of power, the medium through which they commanded the cosmos. Every wound, every drop of blood, every shiver of agony was an offering that maintained the delicate balance of life, death, and the divine. Yet in the repetition of these rituals, a darker reality emerged. The very acts that preserved the world also consumed those who performed them. The queens, though exalted as goddesses on earth, were themselves imprisoned by the demands of faith. They were caught in a cycle where cruelty became sanctity and suffering became honor. The most chilling aspect of these rites was how normalized suffering became. Pain was not only expected, it was revered. A queen who hesitated or faltered was not merely failing herself, she was failing her people, her gods, and the fragile cosmic order. Chroniclers and inscriptions suggest that even minor lapses were treated with public ritual correction, humiliation, or additional bloodletting to restore both divine favor and political authority. In this way, the performance of cruelty became intertwined with leadership. The greater the queen's endurance, the more legitimate her power. To be weak was to be expendable, to be strong was to be divine. The very structures of society demanded that agony be transformed into spectacle, and that spectacle into authority. The rituals themselves evolved into something almost unrecognizable to the modern mind. Where early ceremonies might have involved minor piercings or the symbolic offering of blood, later practices escalated into extreme displays of self-mortification. Obsidian blades and stingray spines were used to draw blood from the tongue, genitals, and earlobes. The queen would perform these acts atop temple steps, before throngs of priests, nobles, and commoners, her agony made visible as a testament to her devotion. Pain became not just sacred but performative. In the smoke of copal and the flicker of torches, the boundaries between ritual and punishment, devotion and cruelty, blurred. Her suffering was both private and public, intimate yet communal, a living paradox that no one could escape. There is evidence that the psychological toll of these rituals was profound. Chronic bloodletting could weaken the body, induce fainting, and cause long-term physical damage. Queens were often pregnant or recovering from childbirth while performing these rites, further straining their endurance. Yet there was no reprieve. In a society where the divine demanded proof of obedience, even exhaustion was insufficient justification to delay ritual. The act of suffering became inseparable from the act of ruling. To falter in one was to falter in the other. In this crucible of expectation, the line between goddess and victim dissolved. To be powerful was to endure was to bleed, and to bleed was to be immortalized, but at a terrifying cost. The paradox of cruelty as honor extended beyond the physical. Queens were psychologically bound to their rituals, conditioned to interpret their pain as divine communication. Every shiver of discomfort, every trickle of blood was a message from the gods, proof of their favor or warning of wrath. In this way, suffering became a tool of moral authority, a psychic instrument that dictated not only the queen's actions but the beliefs of her people. The spectacle of endurance reinforced obedience, faith, and fear in equal measure. Citizens who witnessed their queen's agony were reminded that divine favor could only be maintained through vigilance, sacrifice, and submission to the unyielding laws of the gods. Even the most intimate aspects of a queen's life were subsumed into this calculus of suffering. Fertility, menstruation, childbirth, and sexual activity were all infused with sacred meaning. A queen's body was never her own. It was the vessel of cosmic law, the medium through which creation itself was nurtured and sustained. Personal desire, physical comfort, or emotional safety were luxuries she could not afford. In the very act of living, she performed devotion. In the act of bleeding, she enacted divine justice. Her every movement, thought, and breath became part of the machinery of cosmic balance. The cruelty she endured was never gratuitous. It was moral, political, and metaphysical, a daily affirmation that the universe itself depended on her submission. The ultimate horror of this system lies in its normalization. When cruelty becomes honor, suffering is sanctified, and death itself is a ritualized instrument of power, morality is inverted. Pain is no longer a sign of violence or injustice but a badge of virtue. The queens were celebrated for acts that, by modern standards, would be unconscionable. This inversion is perhaps the darkest lesson of Mayan devotion. The capacity for humans to sanctify suffering, to elevate cruelty into ceremony, and to find divinity in what others would call horror. Through this lens, the Blood Queens were both extraordinary and tragic, women whose courage, faith, and endurance were inseparable from their torment. And yet, in the shadow of cruelty, there was beauty and awe. The rituals connected the human to the divine in ways that ordinary experience cannot fathom. Blood, pain, and sacrifice were not mere punishment but the lifeblood of a civilization, a sacred medium through which the world's mysteries were negotiated. The temples themselves, adorned with carvings of queens and gods intertwined, were monuments to this terrifying devotion. Each scar, each mark of ritual bloodletting, each depiction in stone was testimony to a culture that understood suffering as a conduit to eternity. The cruelty of the rituals became their splendor, the agony of the queens their poetry. In the end, the cruelty that defined the Blood Queens was inseparable from their honor. The two were intertwined like the twin serpents of creation that appear in Mayan iconography, each feeding the other. To endure pain was to assert divine authority. To embrace suffering was to wield cosmic influence. Their legacy is one of paradox. The most horrific acts imaginable became the highest expression of devotion. And while the jungle has long since swallowed the temples, and the cities lie in ruins, the echo of that cruelty as honor continues to resonate, a haunting testament to the extraordinary, terrifying, and sacred lives of the women who bled to sustain a universe. The ruins of the Maya stand silent today, yet the echoes of their rituals still linger in the stone temples and carved lintels. The Blood Queens, whose lives were devoted to the gods through pain and sacrifice, left a legacy that defies comprehension. Their power was inseparable from suffering. Each wound, each drop of blood, each agonized moment was a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. To bleed was to rule, to endure was to sanctify, and through these acts, the queens maintained the balance of the cosmos. Theirs was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but devotion made flesh, a covenant between humanity and gods that demanded extraordinary courage. Their rituals were both intimate and public. Bloodletting, offerings, and ceremonial acts connected their bodies directly to the divine, transforming pain into communication. Through these acts, they embodied both creation and destruction, life and death intertwined. Even today, carvings of queens kneeling before vision serpents or performing sacred rites convey the intensity of these moments, a mixture of fear, awe, and reverence that modern minds struggle to imagine. These women became living instruments of faith, their suffering etched into history as both a warning and a testament to human devotion. Yet there is tragedy in this legacy. The queen's authority relied on their willingness to suffer, binding them to acts that could weaken, scar, or even end their lives. Their devotion elevated them to divine status, but it also consumed them. Pain became honor, cruelty became sacred, and the line between mortality and divinity blurred. Their lives remind us that power and faith often come with extreme cost, and that devotion can demand acts that are both heroic and horrifying. Even in the collapse of the Maya civilization, their influence persisted. The temples overgrown with jungle, the carvings weathered, yet the story of the Blood Queens survives, a haunting echo of devotion, sacrifice, and human endurance. Their blood, once the lifeblood of the cosmos, now stains history itself, reminding us that beauty and horror, life and death, are forever entwined. In their sacrifice, we glimpse the extremes of faith and the profound lengths humanity will go to connect with the divine. The Blood Queens are gone, but their legacy endures, immortalized in stone, myth, and memory. They bled so the world might live, and in doing so, they became timeless, a chilling testament to the power of devotion and the haunting interplay of cruelty and honor.